Hello and welcome to Views on News. I am Jawad Tehami. Pakistan will never forget 16th of December 2014. It is considered as one of the darkest days in the country's history. Why? Because over 140 innocent souls lost their lives to one of the deadliest, the most horrific and the brutal of the terrorist attacks in the country's history. The terrorists barged into Army Public School in Peshawar on this very day back in 2014. And what they did was over there, to those innocent lives, those innocent children who had gone to the school to acquire education for the sacred task they were given to them by their parents, and what they were given in return by those barbarians, those terrorists, the shower of bullets into the heads. Media reports at that time suggested that many bodies were decapitated. And the nation was completely shocked after this horrific terrorist incident. A national consensus was evolved, and that resulted into the formation of the National Action Plan, a 20-point agenda that showed the resolve of the nation to eliminate the scourge of terrorism once for all from Pakistani soil. And regarding this 8th anniversary of this horrific and the brutal terrorist attack, there are certain messages by the top leadership of Pakistan that include President Dr. Arif Alvi, Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, Interior Minister Rana Sanaullah, Information Minister Maryam Aurangzeb, and there is going to be a commemorative event to remember the supreme sacrifice rendered by those innocent souls on this day in 2014 at the United Nations. And the Pakistan's permanent mission to the United Nations has organized this, and Foreign Minister Mr. Bilal Bhutto Zardari is going to attend that. Let me read out certain messages by President, Prime Minister, Information Minister and Interior Minister. President Dr. Arif Alvi, regarding today's significance, said that no act of terrorism can weaken our resolve against this menace. He also said it is a reminder to the international community that terrorism is a common problem for all of us, and we must accelerate our efforts to eliminate it from the world. At the same time, Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif said, 16th of December every year reminds of that pain and agony to the entire nation when terrorists inflicted endless suffering at APS Peshawar. Even after 8 years, this pain cannot be forgotten. Today is the day to pay homage to APS martyrs and express solidarity with their families. Pakistani nation will never forget sacrifices of martyrs. At the same time, Interior Minister Rana Sanaullah in his message said, the wound of APS tragedy is fresh even after 8 years. It can never be forgotten. Entire nation defeated terrorism. He paid homage to the martyrs as well. Minister for Information Maryam Aurangzeb said the nation has come a long way to defeat terrorism, and 16th of December will continue to remind us of the great sacrifices of the martyrs. Let's talk about what Pakistani authorities over the number of years have done in order to eliminate and defeat this menace and scourge of terrorism from its soil. A lot of efforts have been made in this regard. And what needs to be done more, because there has been a recent surge and uptick in violent terrorist attacks in different parts of the country. And especially after the international troops withdrawal from war-ravaged Afghanistan, Afghan Taliban took over. And according to the Doha peace deal, there was a responsibility on the shoulders of the Afghan Taliban also to fulfill their promise that their soil wouldn't be allowed to be used against any other country. There is also one important aspect to this whole equation: the role of the peace spoilers. Pakistan had been advocating a peaceful and stable Afghanistan, and vigorously and rigorously Pakistani authorities had been facilitating the Afghan peace and reconciliation process. But at the same time, there were elements who were trying to spoil peace in Afghanistan. We'll be talking about this particular brutal terrorist attack on 16th of December 2014, and what needs to be done in order to avoid such horrific incidents in future. We are honored to have been joined in the studio by Air Vice Marshal Retired, Mr. Ikramullah Bhatti. He's a senior analyst. Mr. Bhatti, thank you very much for your time, for being on Views on News. And we are also honored to have been joined in the studio by Dr. Zia Shamsi. He's expert foreign affairs. Dr. Shamsi, thank you very much for your time, also for being on Views on News. So let me begin the discussion with you, Mr. Bhatti. It was a horrific attack, one of the deadliest and the most brutal terrorist attacks in the recent history. Innocent children were slaughtered. They were showered with the bullets. Somebody doing that, do you think he's got some human heart in his chest?
Certainly not. It was a very, very inhuman and heinous crime by the TTP, who acknowledged it while based in Afghanistan. And of course, it brought the entire Pakistani nation into a shock, and that is why there was complete political consensus, and they concluded this, as you mentioned, the National Action Plan comprising 20 points, and that was agreed and signed within the next 10 days, which clearly indicated the resolve of Pakistani leadership at that time to not only to understand and appreciate the gravity of this heinous terrorist act and the effect that it has had on the nation, and that the urgency with which it had to be dealt with. And ever since, these successive governments have been trying to implement those action points, and while we'll be discussing it further, some progress has been made, and while there is still a lot that is to be done, so that we can eradicate this menace once for all in totality. And because as we see of late that you mentioned that we have seen a rise in acts of terrorism by TTP, and they cancelled their ceasefire, and they are once again threatening Pakistan. And it's unfortunate that the Taliban government in Afghanistan are unable to prevent that from happening, while they had agreed in the Doha Accord that they would not allow any terrorist act emanating out of Afghanistan against any neighboring country. And Pakistan was hopeful after that once for all the threat or the menace of TTP would be over. But unfortunately, we find that by the release of TTP prisoners in various jails in Afghanistan, and the reuniting of the various factions which were part of Al-Qaeda earlier, and their merger into TTP, has not only strengthened the organization, but also emboldened it to an extent that they are greatly threatening Pakistan, and not only that, they have initiated their attacks over here. So I think it's once again a new challenge for Pakistan, because we now have to revisit our relationship with Afghanistan, and of course come out with a strategy to tackle this threat which has emerged once again, and which is now a serious concern, not just for the bordering areas of FATA and Balochistan, but also we've seen that they've been able to reach deeper.
Right. Mr. Bhatti, your point is well taken. I'll come back to you to discuss certain very important and pertinent points that you've just highlighted. Dr. Shamsi, I'll definitely take your view on this particular thing. We have been joined by another participant in the show on the phone line by Dr. Talat Shabbir. He's expert international relations director at China Studies Center Institute of Strategic Studies in Islamabad. Dr. Shabbir, thank you very much for being at Views on News. I'll come to you regarding your view regarding the supreme sacrifices and the kind of efforts Pakistani authorities have been making over the years in order to eliminate the scourge of terrorism from the country. Now, Dr. Shamsi, it was in real terms a brutal and a horrific attacks by all means and proportions. And then there was a national consensus evolved, and that resulted in the National Action Plan. Interior Minister Rana Sanaullah in his message today has also said that APS tragedy guided the nation to unite against terrorism and religious extremism. So that was a turning point in the country's history, that it was the consensus by all and sundry that we have to get united. And then Pakistan happened to be very much successful in breaking the backbone of the terrorists. Your take regarding that?
Yeah, thank you very much. In fact, it was a national tragedy and remains so. And that is why it is not only this day that it is remembered, it is always remembered. And the cries of those children continue to haunt our ears throughout the year, and not only on this day. Number one. Number two, that was the day when Pakistan, which is a very resilient society and had been subjected to the acts of extremism and terrorism for a very long time, much before 2014. We faced terror attacks on President Musharraf. We lost Benazir Bhutto in a terror attack, and we lost a number of soldiers and civilians all this while. But I think on 16th December 2014, after this tragedy, we as Pakistanis said enough is enough, and then it served as a game changer in our strategy against fight for country's survival against extremism and terrorism. And that is where the consensus was achieved, and armed forces of Pakistan, which were already fighting against terrorism, then got Pakistan Air Force also actively involved and planned properly to fight the terror in a very, very synergetic manner. However, and we did success, we achieved success. However, we could not eliminate them. They were enemies and they are enemies. I'm just trying to draw in comparison between LTTE of Sri Lanka and TTP of Afghanistan.
Right, Dr.
LTTE
Shamsi, I'll
had
beg
to
your
be
pardon.
eliminated.
I have to interrupt you over here. We'll have to go for a short break, and after that we'll be resuming the discussion from here. Welcome back to Views on News. We are discussing the efforts Pakistani authorities have made over the number of years, especially after the APS tragedy on this day back in 2014, to eliminate the menace of terrorism from Pakistan. A short while ago, you were witnessing the speech by Pakistan's Foreign Minister Bilawal Bhutto Zardari at the United Nations. He was addressing a commemorative event to remember those victims of APS tragedy. Let me quickly sum up what he said, because it is also directly related to this particular thing that we are discussing in the program. He said the aim of this particular attack by the terrorists was to kill children and shake the nation's morale. He also said Pakistan's operations against this menace had been successful. He said TTP had taken safe havens somewhere else, and our intelligence agencies have solid proof that Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan is being facilitated and financed by foreign elements, and a comprehensive dossier in this regard has been shared with the international community. And he also said, as per the Doha peace deal, Afghan Taliban had made a promise and had a responsibility. And then he also said that Pakistan will not tolerate such cross-border terrorism, and we reserve the right to take direct action in this regard. He also said that Pakistan looks forward to the international community's help in this regard as well. And in the studio, we are joined by Air Vice Marshal retired Ikramullah Bhatti. He's a senior analyst, and Dr. Shamsi, expert foreign affairs. On the phone line, we are joined by Dr. Talat, Shabbir, expert international relations. So let me resume the discussion with you, Dr. Shabbir. After APS tragedy, and you would have definitely heard what the foreign minister regarding this particular day had to speak at the United Nations on this commemorative event to remember the APS victims. Pakistan made huge efforts and in real terms broke the backbone of the terrorists. Now we have seen an uptick and a resurge of violent terrorist attacks in different parts of the country, and Foreign Minister categorically said that Pakistan reserves the right to take a direct action and we are not going to tolerate this cross-border terrorism. Your take regarding this, sir?
Thank you very much, Jawad, for having me over. I think it's something very tragic that our nation in last 8 years have continuously suffered with the psychological pain of the children. 132 children, 134 lives were lost in this very tragic incident, and it actually has affected our psychology of our nation for a long time. So I think when we talk of Bilawal Bhutto Zardari's speech at New York or elsewhere, officials of Pakistan, when they talk of taking action and try to impede the resurgence of terrorist attacks by TTP. So I think when we had this gory incident had taken place in 2014, we agreed on 20 points of national action plan. And to my opinion, we are much short of what was actually pledged with the nation in those 20 national action plan. There are two aspects of dealing with the issue. One issue is you mentioned that Afghanistan also pledged in Qatar in Doha agreement that they would not facilitate TTP from acting against our country from their land. One aspect is foreign aspect, or for example, you mentioned, and Bilawal Bhutto Zardari also referred to a kind of support that they have, financial support they have from foreign elements, and foreign elements, we mean this India, which is actually playing this card. So there are two elements. One is foreign element, and in which we must be very, very clear to Afghanistan and India that there's no more that you should do with regard to supporting this or help resurging this terrorist outfit. Second aspect is, which relates to 20 points that we decided in National Action Plan. They mostly relate to action taken by our own officials on domestic level. I think the actions taken on domestic level too are short of what we pledged with the nation 8
now,
years back.
Dr. Talat Shabbir, as you speak of this National Action Plan, and you mentioned that there are certain things which need to be implemented. Now, what areas do you think need to be worked upon? There was a revision of this National Action Plan back in 2021 as well. So what areas would you suggest the authorities should be focusing on, especially after this recent uptick in terrorist activities?
The most important is that there has to be a writ of state. The writ of state established against any element that creates trouble in Pakistan. So I think the government of Pakistan and officials and the relevant people, relevant agencies and forces need to create a writ of the government. We have not seen any terrorists being punished. We have not seen any, and of course, the judicial system needs to also look into the fact that how can we establish state of the government through all the, of course, state institutions. The first point that I think is a must is that we must establish state of the state and we must punish these.
Right, Dr. Talat Shabbir, when we've just heard Foreign Minister Bilawal Bhutto Zardari categorically speaking that Pakistan's operations were quite successful, but these TTP militants took safe havens somewhere else. Don't you associate it with the international troops withdrawal that gave a vacuum and the Afghan Taliban came in and took over the reins of the power, and the kind of promise they made in the historic Doha peace deal that won't allow the Afghan soil to be used against any other country? It was more of their responsibility. Right after, as they were taking over Kabul, they released those TTP militants from those prisons as well. Don't you think that has a very big role to play regarding this particular thing, the uptick in violence in Pakistan?
I mentioned first that it was the responsibility of Afghanistan government, the way they pledged that they will tackle this issue, and by releasing many of the criminals, many of the wanted people from their jails soon after takeover in 2021. I think Taliban are equally responsible for creating this mess in our country.
Your point is well taken. I'll take Mr. Ikramullah Bhatti's point of view and Dr. Shamsi's point of view on this one as well. Your point is well taken. I'll come back to you with certain other points to discuss. So, Dr. Shamsi, your take regarding this particular thing, the responsibility of the Afghan Taliban, especially after they took over and the international troops withdrew during the last year. It was their responsibility to not let any militant groups such as the TTP to take safe havens and to launch their terrorist operations from the other side of the border, especially against Pakistan.
Yeah, there is no doubt they committed and it is their responsibility. But we'll have to analyze it with a perspective that how much of control do they have?
They control the largest swathes of Afghan territory.
I understand that. But that's what I'm saying, that do they really have control over these people? Because Afghanistan has been in the grip of such wars and conflicts for the last 4 decades. And it is very common over there that there are independent groups who control different pockets and operate from there. They are funded and supplied with very sophisticated arms by international abettors. And that is why we'll have to really look into this aspect, that whether the present Afghan government has full control over them and in those areas from where these people are operating. Because these groups usually find places where they cannot be controlled, or they have relative freedom to operate. But having said that, it does not absolve Afghan government from the responsibility and the commitment they have made in Doha Agreement, and responsibility squarely lies on them. But as far as Pakistan is concerned, we have to assume that it is our job, and we will have to do it like we have done before. In the past.
We have done it before. There were many measures which were taken regarding the border fencing in order to stop that infiltration of these militants.
Absolutely.
Also, that was a very crucial step in the right direction. Mr. Bhatti, your take regarding what happens to be the responsibility if they have got that entire territory, the larger swathes of that territory under their control. Why have they not been able to curtail that rise in militancy or those groups regrouping and launching terror attacks from that side of the border towards Pakistan?
Okay, first of all, TTP is not indigenous to Afghanistan, as the name implies, Tehrik-e-Taliban, Pakistan. So they do not have any local following or support wherein they could go and live in a place with the help of the local population as they would be indigenous, but they are not. And then we come to the Afghan government not stopping, not preventing their activities, and of course their actions outside Afghanistan. Is it that Afghan government is unable, ill-equipped, doesn't have the capability, or besides inability or lack of capability, there is also a lack of intent? Because the end result is that TTP is in fact based in Afghanistan and they are launching attacks across Afghan border.
So when it comes to the question of intent of the Afghan Taliban or the interim Afghan Taliban that awaits the international recognition, and that is conditioned to the fulfillment of all those promises which have been made by them in the Doha peace deal. When it comes to the question of intent, Pakistani authorities over the number of years have been advocating a peaceful and stable Afghanistan. When it comes to the peace and reconciliation efforts over there for peaceful and stable Afghanistan, Pakistani authorities rigorously and vigorously played their very positive role. And because of that, the historic Doha peace deal between the US and Afghan Taliban was stuck. Now, what happens to be the responsibility when it comes to returning those favors that Pakistan facilitated the peace and reconciliation process over there? So there happens to be a responsibility of returning at least the favor of not letting this soil to be used against Pakistan at least.
Certainly. But the fact is that we have witnessed the release of prisoners from Afghan jails, which included senior TTP activists or leadership, which of course strengthened the TTP. Then again we saw that there was reunification of or unification of various or merger of various factions into TTP, which strengthened them. And then we see that when we analyze the terrorist activities of TTP inside Pakistan, we find that they are using latest weaponry, which was basically...
Where it is coming from, they are being facilitated and financed by some foreign elements, and the dossier of which the Pakistani authorities has shared with the international community.
But they are of American origin, the weaponry, latest. So where would that come from? I mean, that is to come from Afghanistan, locally. I mean, they are not coming from anywhere else. So that means they had access to those weapons, and that could be only possible if the Afghan Taliban allowed that to happen. So I am now pointing at the intent of Afghan Taliban. Their inability understood, but how about their intent? Are they really intending to disallow TTP or prevent TTP from carrying out those attacks while being based in Afghanistan against Pakistan? But that is what the fact is, that is what we are witnessing.
Right. Dr. Talat, Shabbir, if similar sort of incidents, unfortunate incidents continue to happen, and as Mr. Bhatti has mentioned two very important points and in fact raised two important questions regarding the capability and the intent of the Afghan Taliban and their responsibility of not letting the Afghan soil to be used. Does that mean if they are unable to keep that promise in the future as well, and Pakistan continuously gets the threat of cross-border terrorism, then what would be the option? Would the international community think of putting the boots on the ground once again?
Jawad, I think Taliban, when they were taking over Afghanistan in 2021, they in fact not promised, but they said they might take steps towards what the international community expected from them. Many of the promises they made, they have failed to meet up the promises even made with international community. Like promises on women rights and women empowerment and women education promises that they made. They have not been able to streamline or mainstream the way the world expected them to do. Definitely, Taliban are expected to behave from what they were behaving in the 90s. Now that's the international promise that they are not coming and fulfilling. Now, with regards to Pakistan, in our Aswal Fata, the areas where they take it as a platform to launch attacks in the settled areas. It's very, very important for us to to tackle with the situation. Otherwise, it will expand in many settled areas and cities, and it will go on and on. So, though we have been warning Taliban that you exercise some kind of control over these people, but they refuse to accept that they have some kind of control over them. Now, the one thing is still the border that we share with Afghanistan, or the responsibility of Afghanistan, Afghan leaders, to tackle with this issue. I think world community will not be, worrying. It's our worry that TTP is directly impacting our security, our stability in our country. So international community may not, when we are attacked and we are victim of
Dr. Talat,
TTP
Shabbir,
action.
why not? Why not? Pakistan was the frontline ally in the war on terror. And a lot was done by Pakistan, and in this particular effort, as you have heard Foreign Minister Bilawal Bhutto Zardari saying that over 80,000 civilians and soldiers lost their lives, over $120 billion losses to the economy. So supreme sacrifices by Pakistan for the international community, for the global peace and security. Why is the international community not disturbed because when Pakistan is attacked?
Jawad, because this is a real politic. This is a real politic. Nobody, cares if we are attacked. It was only the American interests when they were attacked by the non-state actors. They acted irrationally. They acted against international law, and they came to Afghanistan and stayed there at the cost of $5 trillion. But why would they do it for us? This is a real politics of the world. We need to understand international politics. Pakistan wishes that that world community or the regional countries should recognize Afghanistan, that there should be a degree, measure of stability coming to Afghanistan because of this recognition. But nobody is doing it, because I think China and Pakistan are the two countries which will be the most affected by anything happening in Afghanistan or instability of Afghanistan. And that is what China and Pakistan had always thought, that spillover impact we will face because we are bordering Afghanistan. So this is a real politics. It is our problem, and we, at the end of the day, we will have to resolve this problem. And I think we should come very heavy on Afghanistan government, and we should come very heavy on Taliban. We expected, we had a kind of romance with Taliban, in 90s, and we expected Taliban would behave the same way that they did in 90s. But time has changed. Things have changed. International, environment has changed, and of course, their priorities and their preferences have also changed. This is a change Afghanistan for us. So no, we have to see what we can get from them. I don't see anything we're getting from them. We have to tackle this issue ourselves. We have to do this border management very aggressively and offensively. We have to manage it, because I don't see Taliban helping us out in this regard. And international community, just forget about international community. International community, because we are being killed, we will have losses. We will have losses in our country. International community will not bother. Had they bothered, they would have given recognition to Afghanistan, and they would have helped them curb terrorism. No, we are telling
Your point
them
is well
that
taken.
they
Dr.
going
Talat,
to-
Shabbir, unfortunately, we're short of time. I'll take the view of Dr. Shamsi and Mr. Bhatti on this. The role of international community. Pakistan being the frontline ally in the war on terror. When something happens out there in the world, it happens to be the responsibility of Pakistan to help them out. And when Pakistan is being directly attacked from across the border, and the dossiers, the comprehensive dossiers regarding that are being shared with the international community, why is the international community not pained?
Well, as we just discussed, that it is their moral obligation. But then in real politics, as we just learned, there are no moral values. And in fact, it is Pakistan which is being hurt. It is Pakistan which is bleeding. And it hurts Pakistan the most. So it becomes Pakistan's responsibility to look after itself. I think it is now time that we should consider to take the fight right to the havens of where TTP is hiding, and we need to take the senior players
in Afghanistan.
Of course.
So, Dr. Shamsi, your take regarding this particular international community's role?
No, I've said it before. It is nobody's business. It is Pakistan.
So if it is Pakistan's business only, and we have to deal with this problem by ourselves without international community support, so what happened to be the options for us? We have given the chance to dialogue as well, but the TTP called off the ceasefire. So what happens to be the next option?
Actually, we must understand that TTP had to be eliminated, not silenced. That is where we failed actually. Once we were riding high and we were able to fight them out, we were supposed to eliminate them because they were our enemies. But we kept quiet because we thought we have silenced them, and we thought that the ceasefire is enough. Whereas ceasefire with the enemy is never enough. That is why I was trying to draw the comparison with the LTTE of Sri Lanka. They had to be eliminated. Only then Sri Lankans could sleep tight. In Pakistan, we just silenced them and we thought that we have done enough. No, it was not enough. And now we'll have to restart our fight afresh against the same enemy.
And the responsibility of all the political stakeholders, especially at this point in history, happen to be very crucial.
Absolutely.
That they need to sit together,
Absolutely.
regardless of their political differences, in order to deal with this common threat. Dr. Zia Shamsi, expert foreign affairs, thank you very much for being on the show. We really appreciate your time. And Air Vice Marshal retired Mr. Ikramullah, Bhatti, senior analyst, thank you very much for your time also for being on the show. And on the phone line, Dr. Talat, Shabbir, expert international relations, thank you very much for your time, sir, also for being on Views on News. We really appreciate that. Now, I would like to quote Foreign Minister Bilawal Bhutto Zardari once again. In an earlier speech a short while ago he made at the United Nations for the remembrance of the APS tragedy victims, that Pakistan reserves the right to directly take action against the cross-border terrorism, and the international community has a role and responsibility in this regard to help Pakistan out in counter-terrorism efforts. International community needs to think over it, that when any other country in outer world is affected by terrorism, Pakistan played its positive role. Despite there were a lot of losses incurred in that effort, at the same time there should be a reciprocation from the international community so that any sort of untoward incident of that scale and that proportion as of APS tragedy, in which we lost innocent souls, won't happen again in the future. With that note, we come to the end of today's Views on News. Take good care of yourselves.